what we're doing here. I just made that up. The story that I do, and one of the stories that I have made up recently is this one, A Good Neighborhood, which is a kind of modern fable, and it is the Barnes & Noble 2020 Book Club pick for March. Thank you for joining me here this evening, and thank you to Barnes & Noble for arranging this. When I got the word last fall, I think it was in November, that Barnes & Noble had chosen my book for the March Book Club pick, I was very excited about that. But I wanted to tell everyone, and I couldn't, because they had sworn me to secrecy. And so I thought, well, this is okay. There's a lot to do in the lead up before a book's release. And one of the things that was preoccupying my time over the winter was making arrangements for my book tour. So A Good Neighborhood's release was scheduled for March 10th, and we at St. Martin's Press, my publicist and I, were planning a pretty ambitious book tour. It was, I think, probably 25 different events over 6 weeks, most of those packed into the first 4 weeks. And the run up to that is my publicist puts together all of the events and tells me where I need to be and when. And then I do things like try to figure out what I'm going to say when I go to all of those places. And equally importantly, what am I going to wear when I go to all of those places? And I was trying to think about like how to pack everything into a carry-on bag for the first 2 weeks of tour, which was going to be, I think, like 11 different events before I would get to come home and do laundry. So this was what was preoccupying me sort of going into February and into March as I was getting closer to the book's release date. But what was starting to happen was that we were seeing in the news a lot of reports of this new weird virus that was causing a lot of trouble coming out of China and spreading through the world. And we didn't know whether that was going to have a serious effect on my book tour. And at that time, it was just the book tour that we were thinking about, because we didn't really see the big picture that, of course, is obvious to all of us today. But we were looking at, like, which events should I still plan to do? Which events should I perhaps have to cancel because there were like these hot spots of infectious outbreaks in some of the cities that I was going to be visiting? And so we felt like we were sort of running ahead of, like in an action movie where the ground is collapsing behind you and you're just trying to stay ahead of that disaster right up until the book's release date of March 10th. And so I ended up doing one event here in Raleigh where I live. And then the next day I went to Atlanta and did an event there. And then I came home, and that was it. We pulled the plug on the rest of the book tour. So I was really exhausted, and I attributed that to the stress of all of that indecision and trying to make arrangements on the fly. But as it turns out, I was sick. I had caught a virus. Maybe it was the virus. I don't know. I wasn't able to get a test. But I spent the next couple of weeks sleeping a lot. And then when I started to feel better, I ate a lot of cake, probably more cake than I have eaten in 3 previous years combined. And once Barnes & Noble put the idea to me to doing this event that we're doing tonight live, I started fretting about how I was going to do the event and not come off as a complete fool. Because I've never done a live stream before, and I wanted to not do it badly. So here's what I did. I started watching videos of pros who are doing this kind of thing. And I watched Reese Witherspoon a lot, who does like almost every day an Instagram live broadcast. And I watched John Krasinski with his new program, Some Good News. Maybe you've seen that. Well, I don't have the lovely bone structure that Reese Witherspoon has got, nor do I have the resources to like be perfectly made up and perfectly lighted. I don't have John Krasinski's excellent eyebrows, and I don't have the ability to invite like my celebrity friends to come on my program with me this evening. But I do have something that neither of them have, and that is I have this book, and I get to talk with you guys about it tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, sort of like who I am. I assume that you don't know very much about me before you came to this book. I'm going to talk about how I got inspired to write the book. And then I'm going to move into a discussion of like my take on some of the conversation starter questions that are in the special edition that Barnes & Noble produced for the book club. And then after that, I've got a few questions that we took from the special page that was created for the book club discussion on Barnes & Noble put together on, I don't think it's not on the main page, but it's in association with the main page. And then I will take some questions that you guys post in the comments. Okay, so here's a disclaimer here. If you have not read the book, or you haven't read the book all the way through yet, you probably want to leave this broadcast at the point where I move into those discussion questions, because there will be spoilers. You can come back and watch the whole broadcast all the way through. I think it's going to be archived someplace on the Barnes & Noble page. Okay, so drink. A little bit about me before A Good Neighborhood. I am probably best known for the biographical-based historical novels that I wrote prior to this book. That's these books here. A Well-Behaved Neighborhood, A Well-Behaved Woman is my most recent novel before A Good Neighborhood. And Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald, is the novel that preceded that. And I'm probably best known for Z. It was made into a television series that stars Christina Ricci. You should read the book, and you should definitely watch the show. I have an MFA in creative writing that I earned from North Carolina State University. I did my undergraduate work also at NC State and majored in sociology with a concentration in cultural anthropology. So I have forever been interested in, the ways that people interact with each other, sort of what makes everyone tick. I've been a full-time fiction writer for about a dozen years now. I have 2 sons who are grown-ups. They're married, and I have 2 excellent daughters-in-law and a really lovely stepdaughter whose father I am married to. And you should know who he is. His name is John Kessel, and he is a terrific author. And yes, I have his books here too. The Moon and the Other, read this one. Also, Pride and Prometheus, both excellent books. You should know about these. The Moon and the Other happened to be one of the Washington Post's best books of the year that it was published. So, okay, plug my husband's books. Moving on to some discussion questions here. Sorry, not moving on to discussion questions yet. Before I do that, I want to talk about sort of why I came to write this book, A Good Neighborhood. And that really starts with where I was in the summer of 2018. We were living at that time in a house in a neighborhood very much like the one I wrote about. And in our backyard was this tremendous oak tree. It was one of the reasons that we were so enamored of that house, one of the reasons that we chose it. And in the summer of 2018, I started to notice that that tree was showing some signs of distress. Some of the leaves were dropping, and there was a lot of mistletoe growing on one section of the tree. And it turned out that the tree had been damaged by the construction of the house that was built next door to ours. At the same time that was going on, I was sort of becoming more and more anxious about some of the things that I was seeing in the news around that time, things that had to do with the sort of disintegration of the progress that had been made over the course of the last few decades. I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, and this was a time when it seemed to me, anyway, in my Western Illinois upbringing that was really diverse, where there were a lot of white kids and black kids and Asian kids, and people had migrated there from all different places in the world. It was a real melting pot kind of place. And it seemed to me that the civil rights battles and the equal rights battles and the environmental protection battles that had been ongoing, sort of starting in the 60s and moving into the 70s, had finally been won. And yes, there would still be work to do, but like that progress had been made. And so in 2018, as I was watching, this tree in my backyard start to show signs of possible demise, I was also witnessing the demise of this progress in the ways that people started, I don't know, they were acting badly toward one another in ways that they seemed not to have done so overtly in decades past. So there was a lot of racist behavior and white supremacy behavior and sexist behaviors. And a lot of it was sort of excused by, I don't know, religious beliefs or cultural beliefs, like I can behave this way, it's my right to behave this way. And I was really dismayed by all of that. So as I was thinking about like why my tree might be dying, I thought about gentrification as the cause of that. And then what are the causes of gentrification? And it has a lot to do with the idea that there are people who believe themselves to be above the law, above the rules. Rules are for suckers, right? And when that happens, what you get is the destruction of nice homes in nice neighborhoods so that these great big mansion sorts of homes can be built by people who have great disregard for the environment in which they're building and the culture of the neighborhoods in which they're building, and instead are only motivated really by profit. So out of all of that, this book formed itself up in my head as a kind of a response to my dismay and my feeling of powerlessness about what was happening in the world around me. I think that the good result of that is I found a good outlet for my dismay, and that led to my being right here in front of my little green dot on my computer monitor talking to whoever's tuning in this evening. So now I'm going to address some of those discussion questions and take some of the questions that you all have had. So the first question, as you see on the screen in front of you, early in the novel, Juniper considers what, she wondered, made a neighborhood good. To her parents, good seemed to mean there were mainly other people like themselves. What does make a neighborhood good? I don't know. I feel like this is a situation where good means people being good to each other, not so much good in any kind of material sense, not so much what the value of the homes are or the relative social classes of the people who live there, but whether the people who live in the neighborhood recognize that the other people around them are just as important as they are. And this doesn't mean that everybody has to be involved in everybody else's business. Some people are going to want to be super neighborly. Other people are going to want to be sort of live and let live. But as long as people are not presuming that their rights and their desires are more important than the ones of the people next door or the people across the street or the people around the block, then I think you have a good neighborhood. As new houses are built in older existing neighborhoods, do you think that that changes the feel and culture of a place? I think it definitely does change the feel and the culture of the place, sometimes for good. If the infill homes are built with respect for the pre-existing culture and character of that neighborhood, then I think it's only good. But if people come in and they just tear down those older homes and they build, these mansions without regard for the environment or for the pre-existing culture, then definitely that's a problem. I'm going to be a little ahead of the whole part of that question. For Valerie, tending plants was her therapy. What about the natural world does Valerie take comfort in? What does Valerie's dying oak tree come to represent for her? With that in mind, do you think her lawsuit was reasonable? Valerie went into the study of ecology and environmental protection and forestry, I think because it was a part of the world, a part of her life that she could count on being predictable, right? She grew up in an area of Michigan where her economic circumstances were kind of iffy, and some of the people who surrounded her family life were sort of less than morally cool. And she gravitated toward the study of ecology because this was something that she saw still needed somebody's passionate response to, and she could be a person who could have a demonstrable effect on improving and protecting the environment. Because that's the kind of person she is, like passionate about all of this, the oak tree that's in her backyard, it represents, of course, just a symbol of all of those things that she values, but it also represents something to her sentimentally. So if you remember in the book, she and her husband, Tom, chose the house in Oak Knoll in large part because that tree was in the backyard. And then when she loses Tom short time later and then raises Xavier there in that house by herself, the tree is sort of her companion through Xavier's whole childhood. And now she's at the point where she has lost her husband and she is going to be sending her son off to college in California, on the whole other side of the planet, or sorry, of the continent anyway. And so the tree is this kind of bittersweet symbol for her of everything that was important to her about living there in that house, in that place. So with all of that in mind, was her lawsuit reasonable? If we think about how Valerie approached the idea of creating this lawsuit in the first place, her intention was to actually avoid serious interpersonal conflict and rather approach the situation in a way that would utilize the established guidelines for dealing with the kinds of conflicts you might have in a situation like this. So if we let the law do its job, then we can avoid causing real strife on the local level. So given that her intention was to make it so that people could not be destroying the landscape and the ecology of the area in the future, I feel like with that in mind, it seemed reasonable for her to proceed with the lawsuit as a way to she couldn't resolve, the fact that her own tree was dying, but she hoped, prevent more damage in the future. I mean, consider that what she says in the book, which is that trees create oxygen, and we need 7 trees to exist for every person on the planet. And if we don't have trees making oxygen, basically over time, people suffocate and die, which is a really bad outcome. Almost immediately, we are told, later this summer when the funeral takes place, the media will speculate boldly about who's to blame. They'll challenge attendees to say on camera whose side they're on. And the rest of that question is, how does knowing that a tragedy lies ahead change your reading experience? I can't answer for you, obviously, but I can tell you a little bit about why I chose to set it up that way. So when a writer decides how to structure a novel, there are many different ways that it can be done. What I thought would be most effective for a story like this is to tell you what happened, at least some of what happened, so that your reading experience isn't you reading to find out what's going to happen. You're reading to find out the specifics of what, and more particularly the why. And also, if I plant in your head up front the idea that there was a tragedy, then it changes the kind of suspense that you're reading for. Also, if I say to you, that the people were asked to take sides, then that kind of puts in your head the idea that maybe you, in this situation, would be trying to determine which side you're on. And that's really deliberate. That's part of the reading process that I want to engineer for you, because that means that you're thinking about the kinds of issues that the story is presenting in a whole different way than you would be if you were just reading to find out, oh, what's going to happen. The book club in the novel is reading and discussing Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. How does that classic novel echo or amplify the action in A Good Neighborhood? If you haven't read Lolita, one of the things that probably occurs to you when you hear about the book is maybe you think it's this novel that's about this salacious young woman who seduces this much older man, right? I mean, that seems to be the prevailing idea of what Lolita actually is. But it is so not what Lolita is about. It's one of my favorite novels, and so slipping it into A Good Neighborhood this way was a kind of Easter egg for me. But it has this resonance, I think, with the storylines of all of the main female characters in the book. So if we think about Lolita as a novel that demonstrates vividly the ways that men's desires for and regard for females of any age, whether they're too young, as is in the case of Lolita, or and actually the character Lolita's mother becomes the main character, Humbert's wife, for a time in the book. In our culture, the way men regard women really shapes the way women see themselves and the way women interact with each other, the way that women interact with men, the kinds of expectations that the young women are raised up to have, even if not deliberately. They just permeate the culture. And so that was one of the reasons that it's sort of layered into the story in the way that it is, not necessarily in things that are super important to each of the characters' storylines, but help to inform the kinds of people that they are, so that it helps us to think about those issues with regard especially to Juniper's experience with Brad, right? And the idea that she looked at him, she thought of him as a kind of hero when her mother, Julia, marries him. Juniper's 10 years old, and he's the guy who saved their lives. But she also has a kind of, innocent crush on him that he, takes in a completely different and very wrong and very ultimately damaging way. So yeah, if you're familiar with Lolita, you can see a lot of that resonance in the pages of the book. And if you're not familiar with it, that's a book that I recommend that you pick up and read during all this downtime that so many of us have. Who should shoulder the blame for the chain of aggression between these neighbors? What actions could have been taken by either family to tame the tension? I think this is kind of a trick question, actually. We can look sort of by just points of logic, like, well, if Juniper had just revealed her relationship to her parents, this wouldn't have happened. Or if Valerie had not filed this lawsuit, this wouldn't have happened. Or, if Brad hadn't responded in the way he did to the lawsuit and, just sort of treated it as a legal matter to be resolved in a sensible way, this wouldn't have happened, right? There's a lot of ways we can point at these things in the novel and say, oh, if this, then not the tragic outcome. I think, though, what I would prefer to do is sort of pull back and look at how pointing fingers is not really constructive when it comes to the idea of preventing these kinds of tragic outcomes. We all have a role, okay, in the choices that we make as communities, really, as a culture. And rather than say, it's this person's fault or that person's fault, I think a better way to do it is to sort of look inward and say, what behaviors am I participating in? What am I doing that perpetuate problems? And then maybe we can find ways to prevent rather than to blame when something goes bad. The Greek chorus makes the reader a part of the story and complicit in the action. How did that affect your reading? Who did you believe the we was in the book's narration? I just want to give a shout out to, I think a woman named Jean had that question, a related question in the book club discussion page. She said, who is this we, this royal we that narrates parts of the novel? This is a very unusual point of view for a novel. I first read a book that had this point of view when I read the Jane Austen Book Club by Karen Joy Fowler. And I remember when I was reading it, I was put off initially because I didn't understand who the narrator was supposed to be. And then as I read in further, it became clearer to me that in the case of that story, the we is the members of the book club. And I probably had that in mind a little bit when I was deciding how to structure the point of view for this novel. There are a couple of different ways that authors can do this. And you're probably very familiar with first-person narrator, which is the I, the me, who tells the story, or the sort of classic and traditional third-person narration, which is, he, she, they. And we're really accustomed to that. But I felt like, because I knew that this story was going to be, like I say, a kind of modern fable, I thought that using this point of view choice that goes way back to, way back to really oral storytelling and, was used a lot, say in Shakespeare time, would be the most effective, because what it does is it gives you the intimacy of that sort of first-person narration of someone who's really involved in the events that are occurring in the story, but also gives you a little distance from those events. And then the other layer of that is that we, the readers, are implicated in the events of the story in a way that we would never be if we had the remove of third person or the intimacy of just sort of witnessing what happens in a first-person narration. And so because this was a cautionary tale and because it was kind of a fable, I thought I would try that out. And I actually really like this idea that the Greek chorus sees all and knows most, but they don't know everything, and that helps us as readers to reflect on the things that we're getting from the story. There's a quote from the book. As our resident English professor would remind us, place, especially in stories of the South, is as much a character as any human, and inseparable from, in this case, even necessary to the plot. The novel is set in North Carolina. How does the setting inform the story? Do you think that attitudes and ghosts of history impact the characters in the book? I will let you decide if you think that there's if the ghosts of history impact the characters, but I will tell you why I chose North Carolina as the setting. So some of you probably have never visited the South. Some of you may live in the South and you know that this is going on. But North Carolina and other places in the South are places that are still pretty traditional in their belief systems. There's a lot of active white supremacy here. There's a lot of active, I want to say, sort of pseudo-Christian conservatism. And I say that advisedly because I don't think it has anything to do with the genuine Christian beliefs of folks, but rather the people who use Christianity in order to justify the subjugation of others. And so I needed to represent those forces and how they would impact a situation like this. But then also, I live in North Carolina, and as I said to you earlier this evening, I saw the kinds of effects of these behaviors happening right here around me, not just my tree, but also in my culture, my community. And so it was a natural setting for this story. Did you recognize your teenage self in any of the young characters in this novel? Like Juniper and Xavier, did you also share a strong sense of desiring social justice? Well, I know that a lot of people who read this book shared that strong sense of desiring social justice because I have read some of the reader responses when people tag me in their reviews. Do I recognize myself in these characters? Well, here's something that you may already know, but if you don't know, I will reveal it to you. Every character in every novel that you have ever read has a piece of the author in that character. So everybody in A Good Neighborhood has a little bit of me in them. I could probably spend, the next hour, but we don't have that much time, telling you specifically, which parts of which characters are me. But even Brad has a little bit of me in them. But I will say that when I was a teenager, I had a very strong sense of social justice that made me feel like I had, that I was really smart and I had all the answers to everything. And then I grew up and I realized that I had basically none of the answers to anything, but that desire for social justice was really triggered in the events of, say, 2016 going forward and culminating in my desire to put it all together in this book so that you could think about these things too. Okay, so I think that's all we have for the questions from the discussion guide, but I have a couple more questions that came out of the Facebook group. One of them from Jennifer H. Are you there, Jennifer H? I hope you're there. Why did you choose to only focus on the two families who lived in Oak Knoll? So when a novelist takes on a project, they have to make a lot of decisions up front about what the shape of the story is going to be. And because I knew that I wanted this to be an intimate conflict that resulted, I knew, in a tragedy, then I needed to keep the scope of the story pretty small. And that making it so that it was just these two families meant that you could know everything about what was going on in just those characters' minds and not be distracted by the story of the outside, which we get just a little bit of through that point of view of the neighborhood as the chorus. Susan B. wants to know, oh, well, thank you, Susan B. I hope you're listening, watching. She wants to know if I am working on another novel. Well, the fact is, I'm always working on another novel. I don't always know whether that novel that I'm working on is going to actually turn into the next one that gets published. But right now I have two different ideas that I'm sort of equally in love with. One of them is a contemporary novel. One of them is historical based. And I'm kind of writing both of them to see which one ultimately grabs me. And do we have some questions from comments that readers were posting while I've been talking? I don't know if we do. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do then, since I know we are running out of time and the production folks behind the scenes are telling me that we're getting close to time being up. What I would like to do is, okay, two things. I want to encourage you to continue the conversation in the book-specific Facebook group page that Barnes & Noble has established for conversation and debate about the book. And I will then also tell you about some books that I think you might be interested in knowing about and want to read for yourselves. All right, behind me, oops. I won't be able to tell you too much about all of these books. And if you can't remember the titles, you can always come back and look at this part of the broadcast later. All right, so first up, this is a marvelous novel by Alex George called The Paris Hours. And this book comes out in early May. Alex is a terrific person, an excellent writer who happens to also own an independent bookstore and run a book festival where I would have been appearing this month had the virus not overtaken everything. You should know about this novel, The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles. This is a really lovely story. I've read The Paris Hours. I've read The Prettiest Star, a novel set in the 80s with a young man who leaves his home in Appalachia and goes to New York City. He's a gay young man who wants to live a much more vivid life in Appalachia, but contracts HIV and then comes back home after he takes ill. Wonderful, really lovely, poignant novel. This is Remembrance by Rita Woods. And this is a debut novel by a woman who is a physician, kind of on the front lines of things that are going on right now. It's a wonderful historical braided character narrative with some fantastical elements. Oh, here's a question. Let's see. Marissa G asks, Nia P asks, what advice do you have for budding writers? Oh gosh, probably many of the things that you've already heard from authors, but the thing that you have to do is persist, right? The biggest difference between the author who succeeds and the author who does not succeed is persistence. You're going to get lots of rejections. You're going to get lots of criticism. People are not going to always love what you write. Once you do get published, some things will be well received and some things will not be. You may have, a terrible sales trajectory for a book that makes it really difficult for you to publish your next book. All of those things lie ahead if the writing life is something that you want, and you just have to be a person who goes and sits down and writes the next thing tomorrow anyway. Persistence is the main thing. Another question, Marissa. Thank you, Marissa. I love all your books. Could you tell me what made you take a little bit of a different path with this genre? I thank you. I appreciate that you love my other books. I was actually going to write another historical-based novel before I wrote A Good Neighborhood, but I was so distressed by, so many things that were happening at that time, and this novel just sort of became so urgent to me that I thought I would write it and see what happens to that. So it wasn't really like I need to do something different in my career. It was just really I need to write this book right now, and I'm kind of waiting for that. Like I said, I have these two competing ideas. I'm waiting for that, like which, pick me moment with one of the books I'm working on. Okay, and then two more books, and then I think we're probably out of time. So please look for this wonderful novel, a World War II setting mother-daughter story called The Yellow Bird Sings by Jennifer Rosner. Beautiful story. And finally, one more debut by an author that is here in my area, Wildland by Rebecca Hodge. Both Rebecca and Rita Woods, who I told you about a minute ago, who wrote Remembrance, are women who became published with their first novels well into middle age. So if you are a writer who's still aspiring and you think it's never going to happen, what did I say earlier? The message is persist. And I think that's all we have time for tonight. Gosh, this has been so great, and I have really enjoyed it. And I'm sorry that we're out of time, but I do thank you for tuning in. Follow our page as we announce our next event, they say. And I hope to see you when I eventually get back on the road and do some book events in real time. Good night.